giving this presentation. We see a lot of activity around autonomous vehicles, and we've already heard a little bit about that. And we also see a lot of activity and experimentation, demonstration around goods transport. And these are just two of the many, many projects that can be identified. Upper picture is from Peloton Technology, and they've done a platooning demonstration project in Michigan recently, and they hope to move this technology into commercial application later this year. Below, it's really about sort of the small pods that is driving down. It's Starship Technologies, which is a company set up by the people behind Skype. And it's a small ground drone that sort of takes care of the last mile delivery. And it's currently being tested in London in various locations. So partly linked to all these demonstrations, we've seen a huge surge in the expectations around autonomous vehicles. And this is really a quote from a recent article on the website stroke.com, where the author makes a distinction between what he calls lifestyle mobility and commodity mobility. Lifestyle mobility is much more leisurely. This is the type of mobility where the moving and the driving is the fun part of it, unlikely to be automated. But the bulk of our mobility is what he calls commodity mobility, and this is where autonomy and automation will have a big role to play. And interestingly, this person is predicting that it will be freight and logistics where these developments will happen first, which is kind of contrary to the broader discourse, because I think most of the discourse is focused on passenger transport. But the reason why is because freight sector is much more strongly focused on questions of cost and would be able, at least in theory, to cover some of the costs that Louis was already talking about. So what we see is many of this kind of graphs. This is a fairly optimistic one, but you can find similar ones on the internet if you do just a little search. So we see this gradual moving of increasing levels of automation over time, and somewhere over the next 2 decades we'll end up with a fully automated transport system. What we've done in the UK is actually talk to people in the freight sector, stakeholders, various organizations, various companies, policymakers, to sort of try to get a sense as to how they think about the future of automation in their sector. And it turns out that their expectations are A, much more nuanced, and B, much more divergent compared to what you see in the broader, certainly the broader media discourse, but also much of the policy discourse, because I should really say in the UK, automation has really caught on, and DFT officials now give presentations that present a very rosy future for when it comes to automation in transport. And what we see across our interviews that Debbie has conducted is that people do recognize the cost savings, and that those are potentially significant. In the UK, transport, you have to reckon that about 1/3 of the cost in freight is for fuel, 1/3 is labor, 1/3 is rest. And people reckon that both labor costs can be significantly reduced and fuel costs can be significantly reduced. It's not quite clear how big those reductions are, but particularly on the labor side, they can be potentially significant in the sense that you no longer have to comply with labor regulation about the number of hours that people may drive on the roads. There's potential for reducing the amount of space in a vehicle that you have to allocate to the driver's activity, whether that's sort of where they sit or where they sleep. And third, there, in theory, are fewer human errors that may also cause all kinds of cost. At the same time, there's a lot of skepticism and many people, frankly, don't believe that this is going to happen. And I find that a very interesting discrepancy. And what I want to do today is really think through that discrepancy and maybe taking that skepticism, that divergence of expectations into consideration, what that means for potential development of trajectories of automation in goods mobility. The focus throughout is on the UK because that's where my research is taking place. I do think that quite a bit of what I'm saying is transferable to the States, but there are obviously very significant differences, if only because our country is much smaller than the US. But I'm very interested to hear from you whether you think some of what I'm saying is actually resonating with what you are seeing here. So when I talk about goods mobilities, I'm not talking about everything that you see on this slide. I'm really sort of focused on ground transport and both sort of heavy goods between cities and delivery, sort of first mile, last mile delivery traffic in mostly urban settings. So I'm not sure what the discourse is about. It is around here, but in the UK, everyone's talking about drones these days. I won't be talking about drones. If you have any questions, we can do that in the Q&A. But I find it fascinating how this is capturing the imagination in the UK and some other countries. Debbie has done a lot of work in New Zealand, where it's even more of a craze. And I think maybe in some other seminar in the future we can talk more specifically about the future of drone transport. I think there are at least three sets of reasons why we see this discrepancy in expectations about automation between some of the stakeholders in the industry and the wider debate. Part of that is because a lot of the discourse is what I call performative. It tries to create the conditions favorable to the rapid diffusion of automation in transport. It really is there to create support, get more financial investment, get more backup and support from policymakers, and to create wider legitimacy. And why is that? That is needed because innovations like automation don't face a level playing field. Innovation doesn't happen out of thin air. It needs to take place as part of existing systems that have been functioning for quite some time and have all kinds of built-in mechanisms that reproduce themselves. So there's a lot of part dependency, there's a lot of lock-in that favors incremental changes over more radical changes. And when I talk about a system, I'm really talking about what we call a sociotechnical system. And that is covering all the things that you see here on this slide. So this is much more than simply the road infrastructure and vehicle. It is just as much about fuel infrastructures, about user practices, the cultural values inscribed into a system. It's about maintenance and distribution. It's about regulation and policy. And our argument is that you need to look at all these elements to really understand some of the complexities around these innovation processes. And once you take sort of these systems into account and the path dependency and the extent to which they reproduce themselves, you also start to appreciate that for innovations, legitimacy needs to be created. They need to become embedded in those existing systems. And a colleague and co-worker of mine, Professor Frank Gales, has written extensively about that and basically argued that this societal embedding means that you not only have to convince the world of business or the world of policy, you also have to create support and legitimacy among users and society at large. And I think when we look at what's happening around automated transport, the emphasis tends to be on the business and the policy world, and there's not enough happening on the user and the broader society side of things. So how do you create legitimacy? Well, discourse, positive discourses, positive representations of how great a certain innovation is or how rapidly it will change things, is a very effective way of creating the conditions for uptake. And what happens often is that through the creation, with the creation of these positive discourses, you get what sociologists of technology call a hype disappointment cycle. And this is not specific to autonomous vehicles. This occurs for most new technological innovations, where you see that expectations go up rapidly to the extent that everyone thinks this is going to be radically changing all kinds of things. People at some point start to realize that the development doesn't happen as fast as they expected it to happen, so people start to become bored, disappointed, and you get sort of a fall in the support. And then the critical thing is what happens next. Does it fall to such an extent that almost all the support for the innovation disappears? Or does it fall to such an extent that there still is a reasonable level of support that allows the innovation to be developed further, albeit not at the pace people thought that what would happen originally? Now, transport is a sector where we've got many of these hype disappointment cycles. This is from a study published a couple of years ago in Nature Energy by some American researchers, which has looked at hype disappointment cycles with regard to alternative fuels in the US. And as you can see, over the past decades, we've had quite a few of these hype disappointment cycles for various fuels. Battery electric vehicles had sort of the first surge in the 1990s. They had another one recently, and actually I think we're now sort of up on the third if you look at sort of what's happening. We've had others as well. Where we are now in terms of alternative fuels, well, it's not really the best place to be. So I just want to say that this kind of pattern is happening quite regularly. Whether this also is going to happen around around automated transport, I don't know. I think it's too early to say. But there is some evidence that we are at least sort of at the first part of that steep curve. This is a series of diagrams by a company called Gartner, who track hype disappointment cycles for a whole lot of different technologies, not just in transport, but sort of all kinds of information technology innovations. And if you look at what's happened over the last couple of years, you see that autonomous vehicles has moved sort of over the maximum of the curve. And it'll be very interesting to see what they predict for what they show for 2018. Discourse not only creates positive understandings of a new innovation, it also makes trajectories of change understandable. And I think here, the levels of automation that Louis introduced earlier are very, very important. Because what they do is that they basically simplify and turn that transition into a more or less linear process if you understand that you move from level 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. And I think that makes the transition understandable, helps us imagine what's happening. But it also kind of makes it inevitable, particularly if we sort of talk about how in the past cars were level 0, we're currently level 1, 2, sort of 3 is being experimented with, and we've seen some of the risks a couple of weeks ago in Tempe, and we move to 4 and 5 into the future. It's almost like there's a natural flow through these levels. What they also do is that I think they greatly reduce the complexity of the relationships between the human and technology, because what they do is they kind of make us understand this transition as a simple transfer of responsibility from the driver to the machine. And I think that's on one level what's going on, but it's also reducing much more most of the entanglement and the intrinsic complexity of how this new technology operate. It presents too simple a understanding of what's at stake here. I think then there is something else going on, because there's a much broader sense of belief in technology, a very techno-optimistic understanding. And part of that is central to European, Western society, particularly sort of on the neoliberal capitalism. But transport as a sector has a very long tradition of techno-optimistic understandings about the future. And I think techno-optimism is great and it's very useful, but there are risks, and that is that the unintended and unanticipated consequences are significantly and systematically disregarded. And Louis already alluded to that earlier, and I think this is really something we haven't thought through carefully enough when it comes to automation in transport. So there's a lot of work still to be done there. And just to give you one simple example of some research we've done in relation to greater fuel efficiency in fuel economy in transports, is that about 25% of the gains in fuel efficiency are being undone by people driving further, by what we call rebound effect. So that's a very significant effect, and it has huge policy significance. But what we see in the UK, that policymakers really, really struggle with taking on board this notion, partly because it obviously undercuts some of the arguments for the policy interventions they propose, but also because I think that there's a level of complexity here that they find really, really difficult to communicate to the people they're accountable to, particularly if you think about politicians. So I think we, as researchers, really have a lot of work to do in terms of making those kinds of complexities understandable to a wider audience. This framing of techno-optimism really rests on this instrumentalist logic that technology can solve our problems. And I think when it comes to automation, we see that very, very strongly. And we already mentioned about how the UK has now bought into this. And you see that here's sort of a summary of what's been said before about all the many benefits that automation is bringing. And if you look at if you do a critical analysis of the policy documents, you only see winners. We only gain from these innovations. There's nothing about the losers, the people who drop out, the people who might somehow be adversely affected. And I think that's problematic. When it comes to freight, and particularly when it comes to urban freight, there's an even stronger case for automation to be made, or being made by policymakers, because at least in the UK, urban freight vans are, you could say, kind of the bad guy. They're sort of becoming the scapegoat for a lot of the problems. Partly because it's very strong growth, is what you can see here. The big growth is really happening in vans, and particularly over the last 7 years or so, post the economic recession, we see that they are sort of the fastest growing segment of the transport sector. They cause a lot of congestion, a lot of parking problem. They cause there's a lot of antagonism with cyclists and pedestrians in cities like London, particularly now that these cities are going through processes of making car traffic less easy by sort of narrowing roads, taking away space from cars, and so on and so forth. Plus, there's the whole debate about air pollution, and most of these are diesel-driven, and it's a very significant issue. And they're being blamed for the very poor working conditions that they offer. It's like sort of the Uber and Deliveroo. Do you have Deliveroo? Sort of food. Yeah. Well, those kinds of companies are now sort of really being brought to the courts in the UK and in other European countries, because of the very poor labour conditions that they offer. Now, many of these urban freight delivery companies who do the work for Amazon are essentially sort of offering the same kinds of labour conditions as you would get with Uber or Lyft and so on. So there's a lot of opposition at the moment. What we see specifically in the goods mobility sector in the UK, which makes all of this even more complex, is that we have a particular culture. We have a culture of short-termism and risk aversion. Short-termism really means trying to get the next contract sorted. And I'm not saying this to blame anyone. I think this is a perfectly rational response given the very strong competition they're under, particularly now that we're still part of the EU and we have many much more cheap providers from Eastern Europe coming to the UK and basically undermining what was traditionally a predominantly UK-based sector. We got high levels of self-employment, which means that we have a substantial number of large companies, but we have a much larger number of owner-occupiers. Basically, one-driver companies who drive their vehicle around, and often you get a very interesting gender division of labour, where it's the husband who's driving the van or the truck, whilst it's the female spouse who's doing the admin and running the business, more on that side of things. And particularly these small companies, it's not at all clear how they can pay for the extra costs that will come with an autonomous vehicle. And I think it goes back to what Louis was saying as well. I don't think this is a market segment that will easily buy into these new vehicles. So we see the same on sort of the urban side with sort of these small companies and sort of small self-employed entrepreneurs who work for the companies that do the work for Amazon and other sort of other online retailers. And then at the same time we also have very strong driver shortages in the UK. This is a really big problem to attract reliable drivers who do the work, partly because the working conditions are quite difficult, but that actually may help to facilitate the transition towards automation. Although at the same time, it should be clear that automation is not necessarily replacing the driver. That I think one of the key findings from our study is that the idea that automation will mean that drivers will disappear is a myth for many people in the industry. It is really about the role of the human changing on board of that vehicle. And one of our interviewees talked about how this role is changing from the king of the road to the captain of the ship. Someone becoming much more like a manager who can sort of make sure that everything operates well and who can still provide that point of human contact with the people, with the clients, the customers. So I think there's a lot of interesting things going on. Briefly, what does this mean for the future? I've shown you this diagram, and I think it's a very interesting one, but it comes with very strong assumptions. One of it is that it kind of implies this linear pathway through time. Secondly, it's assuming that this process is spatially ubiquitous, that it will occur everywhere to the same extent. And three, it kind of assumes that we get something like an S-curve. It kind of builds on the very conventional Rogers model of innovation diffusion, where you've got sort of early adopters and then you've got sort of a very strong growth and when sort of the majority is following, and then you get the laggards accepting the technology, taking up the technology at the very end. Now, this is kind of the pathway implied in the previous slides. Increasingly, people are predicting that we're going to skip level 3. And I think what we've seen with the Uber crash and the Tesla crash, that there is a case for that to happen. But even that may not be complex enough, and what we'll see is something that is much more like this, where we see different things happening at different speeds in different localities. However, I think there's more going on, because many people kind of assume that what will happen is that the existing system will at some point go through a period of turmoil and then stabilize into a fundamentally different system. This is a diagram, again, constructed by my colleague Frank Gales, who sort of argues that we have this existing sociotechnical system, which you hear called sociotechnical regimes, which is changing under the influence of what he calls landscape developments and niche developments. Landscape developments are basically broader contextual changes outside of that existing system. So that can be climate change, the rise of the information age, economic recession, demographic aging, sort of the economic transformation where sort of Asia is becoming much more important at the expense of Europe and North America. All kinds of developments that potentially put existing systems under pressure. At the same time, you've got what he calls niche innovations. These are the radical innovations, like automation I'm talking about, that need the protection, hence they need to sort of mature in niches, in order to at some point compete with the existing regime. And the idea here is that if you mature these innovations in niches, they become stronger, and at some point, when there's enough pressure on the regime, they will be able to compete, and they will significantly reconfigure or transform the existing system. And this is a model that's not specifically developed for mobility, but it works quite well in mobility as well, I think. But this kind of is the idea that we see sort of wholesale system reconfiguration, and many people tend to imagine this is what's going to happen with automated transport as well. Now, what you want to do here in terms of strengthening your radical innovation is do demonstration projects, experimentation, and so on. The kind of projects that Steve was talking about, the kind of project I started off with during my presentation, those are sort of really to facilitate social learning, institutional learning, technological learning, to improve those innovations and make them ultimately competitive to the existing regime. And what we see in the UK in particular is that government is fully committed to facilitating these kinds of processes. And we've just published this paper in an open access journal called Sustainability